Hello, and welcome to Thoughts on Sex Robots, a novel ethical application with Zachary Delk. This is for MTRE 6750 or Ethics in Robotics. Now, to start off, we're going to need to describe what a sex robot is. Sex robot, also known as robotic sex doll or sex bot. In more recent years, it's been referred to as a companion robot by companies that want to appeal to a broader audience. It's generally just a humanoid or anthropomorphic robot that is primarily designed for sexual gratification. The first instance of a true sex robot is Roxy, which was debuted at a 2010 Adult Expo. This robot had AI capabilities where it would learn about the user to facilitate enhanced communication. It would be able to remember what the user was doing as far as like on a day-to-day basis and facilitate better conversations than just like a pre-recorded doll. In more recent years, there's been a lot of updates as far as making them hyper-realistic and adding extra capabilities. The one pictured now is the Harmony doll or Harmony robot from Real Doll. This one has a more advanced AI. It's got more movement capabilities, mostly in the face. It can do more human-like facial expressions. It can move its head a little bit and can move its shoulders a little bit. Some of the sex robots that are out there can move their hands, some can move their hips a little bit, some come with heaters internally or internal vibrators, things of that nature, but none of them are like fully autonomous, like have walking capabilities. So the majority of the robot is just posable. It's a very small part of it that has mechanics to it. But before we get into the applications and the ethics, we're going to be talking about some of the literature that's out there. To start off, we're going to be talking about a paper titled Ethics of Sex Robots. In this paper, the author in their initial paragraph sets the baseline that they are working on the assumption that sex robots are objects and thus cannot be morally harmed. You cannot do moral wrong to a sex robot, but your actions can be morally wrong. He does note some potential positive use cases for these robots. The first one being the use case for people with disabilities. So a person who is not normally able to engage in sexual encounters with another human being, they could use this as a tool to preserve some of their dignity while also working through issues. Then there's a therapeutic aspect. If used correctly, it could help with trauma victims or people who have lost loved ones or lovers and allow them to cope through difficult times to regain their dignity and get back to where they used to be. The final case that he notes is it could be a potential outlet for people who just kind of have a hard time finding a sexual partner or forming real relationships with humans. He immediately notes after listing this that that is a very fine line to walk. It can very easily turn into promoting isolationism or enhancing antisocial behavior in individuals, depending on if they're vulnerable to it or not. And then there are three ethical concerns that he mentioned in the paper. The first being the objectification of women, mainly because it can very easily embody harmful female stereotypes. It can be hypersexualized, whether that's by appearance or personality. There is the ethical question on its capabilities. Should it be able to simulate certain sexual activities or things like non-consensual encounters, which we'll talk about later. And then finally, there's just the blanket. It should not be able to resemble a child in no way, shape, or form. The devil's advocate approach to this would be by emulating a child or resembling a child, it would potentially reduce real world harm, but it's more likely going to just embolden the users and then translate to increased level of real world harm. The author's stance on the matter is that sex robots are a thing that exist and there is a desire behind them. There's a reason for their existence. And his stance is that it should be treated like drugs, alcohol, pornography, that there should be regulations and people should take a harm reduction approach to it. Then on the personal perspective of sex robots, this paper is a critique of David Levy's book, Love Plus Sex with Robots. David Levy is a staunch supporter of sex robots. He has been quoted with saying that sex robots will be better at sex than humans, that in a few years' time there will be no need for human-on-human sexual encounters, that sex robots are a means of increasing a user's self-esteem by use of praise and validation. And Levy, just in general, kind of has a reductionist view on sex. He views it as just a thing of pleasure. There's no real deeper moral justification or reasoning behind it. It's just pleasure for the sake of pleasure. The initial critique that the author brings up is that of Kathleen Richardson, who is a radical feminist and the leader of Campaign Against Porn Robots. It was formerly titled Campaign Against Sex Robots, but in recent years they have changed their group name. Now she is on the stance that sex robots further commodify physical connection. So similar to prostitution and pornography, or mainly prostitution, but it attaches a dollar value to sexual gratification, which does not lead to positive relationships. She also is on the firm stance that it is used to objectify women and children, and thus should not exist in its entirety. There's a split among feminists, with the sex-positive feminists taking the stance of if it can be a tool that does not objectify women and promotes positive moral values, it could be used to promote sexual liberation for both genders. And then for the personalist perspective from this paper, it's based on the assumption that human-on-human relationships are I-thou, meaning that there's an equal sense to them, and then the relationships between a person and a object are I-it. And if you take the stance that a sex robot is a human analog, at best it would be pseudo I-thou and therefore morally deficient. a sex robot is going to offer unconditional acceptance and guaranteed loyalty, which removes any possibilities of higher good that come from true relationships where there is challenges and threats that come up, where things like if someone gets sick and you have to take care of them, you're building empathy, you're reinforcing positive virtues, you're showing compassion, and then the ultimate moral good and personalist being the self-sacrificial love that comes from putting someone else's needs in front of your own, which is not possible with a sex robot relationship. The author also notes that it has a high potential to foster avoidance of general connection between real humans. Then we're moving on to the perspective of machine ethics. Now, machine ethics is just the morality that is applied to a semi or fully autonomous machine. So what framework of ethics does the machine have? This author asks a lot of questions and answers very few, but there were a couple that stood out. Mainly, should the sex robot have any moral skills? Should it have moral autonomy in any sense of the word? There's the positive and negative impacts of this. The positive that he noted would be the robot itself could explain and justify its existence to a user's friend or family, to remove their hesitancy towards the situation. But then this can also be a negative aspect because it would be sharing details that the user might not want to be shared depending on what's happening, which would be degrading the dignity of the user itself or user themselves. And then if a robot is a moral agent, what type of theory should it follow? Given the robotic nature of the situation, strictly human-based ethics won't really line up well. So therefore, there needs to be some sort of generalized robotic ethics that can be applied to this framework. There's also many concerns with if certain behaviors should be limited or regulated or just outright banned, and this is the same with appearance. There's also the aspect of should they be modeled after humans or should it be more machine-like and thus not foster a disillusionment that can happen. The final thing that he brings up are just kind of meta concerns about data and liability. If a robot equipped with AI is in your house and you're engaging with it sexually, it's going to get data that you might not want leaked anywhere. So who's in charge of that? There's also liability concerns on if it is morally autonomous. If something happens, who's to blame for that? And the final paper for this review is Robots, Rape, and Representation. Now, this paper asks the interesting question of, is it moral to design a robot that can refuse sexual advances? There's two thought processes. There is that the robot should be able to refuse, which if you look at it as a human analog, given its robotic nature, and assuming that it's not going to necessarily fight back, it's just going to say no, this would kind of open up the possibility of sexual assault of a robot, even if it's a byproduct. This is going to facilitate things like rape fantasies or sadistic behavior in individuals. And even if you look at it as the robot as an object and thus cannot be sexually assaulted, it's still reinforcing that behavior in the user themselves. And if you look at it as sex robots shouldn't be able to refuse, if they are human analogs and they can't refuse, is their inability to refuse implying consent? The negative aspect of this that the author mentions is that if you portray relationships in this light, you're going to build up a false representation of what relationships are and what it means to interact with a member of whatever sex you're pursuing, and that you might perceive them as always available and always accepting, which is not reality, and thus fosters negative relationships. And if you're saying that it is a human analog, but the inability to consent or the inability to refuse does not imply consent, then pretty much all sexual interactions with a sex robot would be assault. So there's no moral justification that can be made there. And if you're saying that a sex robot shouldn't be able to refuse because it is an object, this is more morally justifiable because of the context of an object. An object shouldn't be able to refuse what it was designed to do, like a wash machine not washing the dishes or lawnmower not cutting the grass. So this sort of justification makes it a little bit more plausible to be ethical, but this would also greatly benefit from the robot not being humanoid, taking a more machine-like appearance, whatever that may be. Next, we're going to get into the ethical theory that we're going to be using. We're going to stick with two, that being virtue theory and personalist theory, or personalist ethics. For virtue theory, people are moral agents, and they're shaped by their habits, their community, their surroundings. A moral person is going to choose actions that align with virtues, so the golden mean. They're going to constantly develop these virtues over the course of their life, and this in turn leads to a positive life, or eudaimonia. And then a moral person is going to choose actions not based out of fear or coercion. They're going to choose these actions because it is what a moral person would do, thus instilling and further developing their own morals. Some examples of virtues are honesty, compassion, courage. One of the big ones for things like a sex robot would be temperance and modesty as well. For the personalist ethics, this takes the deontology approach. For humans are never means to an end. They're always the end in and of themselves. But this also respects the inherent dignity of a person. Everyone has an inherent amount of dignity, and everyone should strive to preserve not just their own, but other people's dignity. And then a moral person is built by their relationships, by this constant respecting of other people's boundaries is another way of thinking about it. And then the ultimate moral good for a personalist perspective is that self-sacrificial love, putting others before yourself. So to move on to the actual application of the theory, we're going to be asking three questions. First up is going to be, what is a moral framework that should be followed? This is going to be the combination of personalist ethics and virtue ethics. The personalist aspect brings in that foundational belief that people are always the ends, never the means. and you want to preserve the dignity of the user. You shouldn't encourage isolationism. You shouldn't encourage negative social actions. You should instill dignity into the user. And then for preserving dignity in others, you shouldn't aim to objectify any one group. It should be naturalized. It shouldn't be hypersexualized in that sense. And you should always strive to promote healthy relationships. The virtue ethics aspect of it, focusing on temperance and compassion. For temperance, you shouldn't strive for your product, at least if it's a sex robot, to be hyper addictive. There should be some sort of constraint or moderation, so that the users can more easily practice modesty and avoid overindulgence. And then for the compassion side, it should be geared towards being a tool for those in need, whether that be like a default setting where it's built for therapy, and not just it's built for sexual gratification or simple pleasures. Ultimately, they should try to promote human flourishing with their creations. And is there a possible ethical way to create sex robots? If you're creating them as a human analog, meaning to replace human relationships, the perceived pros could be that there would be better sex, which would be a higher or more intense, lower hedonistic pleasure, which doesn't have too much moral weight. One of the other pros that could be seen is the potential use for therapeutic reasons, meaning that you're striving to return the dignity to the user by fostering, while a artificial, still some semblance of relationship that can strive to return a person to their former dignity. The negative connotations of a human analog would be that it's extremely easy to portray women or men in a negative light in this way by hypersexualization, by setting unrealistic standards or expectations when it comes to forming a relationship. And it would further incentivize isolationism by degrading the relationships of the community, and then also degrading the moral standards of the user themselves. Strictly as a tool, meaning that it's non-humanoid and has no moral agency. It could be seen as like a harm reduction thing. If there's a couple and one member of the couple has just a higher sex drive or something like that, it can be used as a tool to channel that sexual desire. So you're taking it out on a tool versus resorting to a manipulative behavior or something like adultery, which is not good in relationships. If it's not humanoid, it's less likely to portray women in a negative light, because you are not sexualizing the inspiration, you're sexualizing the object. So this would aim to preserve the dignity of women or whatever the robot would be modeled after. And this makes it a little bit easier to morally universalize. If it's a tool that does good and that's used for good reason, and there's very few or hopefully none for negative aspects that come out of it, it could be used or should be used. Some cons of this: it does reduce sex to just pleasure, or the reductionist approach. which can strip any positive moral virtues that come from building relationships, like, gaining empathy, gaining compassion, things of that nature. And there's also the risk of incentivizing isolationism while also promoting overindulgence. For our final question, what constitutes an ethical sex robot creator? They should enforce strict limits on design. Mainly, first and foremost, shouldn't look like a child. Just across the board, corrupts character, disrespects the sacredness of childhood, and even with positive intentions, there's too many negative possibilities. Even for like something like emulation for age play, the fetish in of itself is morally gray, and more if you remove the human aspect and having a human on robot fetishism, it just turns completely negative. There's no real moral ground for it to stand on. They should strive to reduce the hypersexualization that's currently happening with them, whether this be by appearance. They should aim to preserve human dignity, reduce objectification, make it more natural. This goes for personality as well. There should be some sort of limit that's inherent to the robot, and it should work to minimize unrealistic expectations. Finally, for the design limitations, it shouldn't be able to take on any sort of politically incorrect appearance or personality, whether this is racial, physical, mental. You want to remove the chances for immoral fetishism, and not exploit any sort of vulnerable groups. And the designer should aim to complement relationships, not replace. It shouldn't be able to emulate higher level emotions, because that would promote false relationships, isolation, and then foster a disillusionment that the relationship between a human and a sex robot is real in any real sense of the word when it's not. And they should focus on meeting a need versus being pleasure for the sake of pleasure, whether that's having something like a therapeutic default on the robot or having it set up through some way where it's trying to reinforce positive behavior, and it should foster moral growth and focus on things like compassion, empathy, self-respect, respecting others, preserving dignity in and of yourself for others, things of that nature. And then finally, just as like a marketing standpoint, it shouldn't be marketed towards vulnerable groups. It shouldn't be a AI girlfriend. It shouldn't be a replace your wife. Don't ever need to leave the house again type thing. It shouldn't be aimed towards vulnerable individuals. You want to preserve their dignity and minimize the amount of moral degradation that can come from things like overindulgence or lack of modesty, things like that. So, in conclusion, this topic can get very nuanced very quickly. There's a lot of different aspects to it. There's a lot of different ways to view things. And this is in no way a complete ethical framework for the situation. There's also the users and the robot itself that has to be taken into consideration. At best, it's gray, morally gray. It's very easy for it to be immoral, whether that's its design or its use. And if companies who create these products have a desire for it to be perceived and used more ethically, there has to be a shift from the combination of hyper realism and hypersexualized nature of the robots that currently exist, to more of a therapeutic holistic, morally beneficial, focused on human flourishing versus baseline instinctual desires. And that's all. Thank you.